Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back from break, everyone. I hope your snacks were tasty. My name is Audrey Tron-Lam, and I am the Environmental Health Program Director at the University of Northern Iowa's Center for Energy and Environmental Education. And it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our two speakers for this afternoon, who will present on agriculture and cancer. What do we know? What's left to learn? And what can we do? Excuse me. Our first presenter is Dr. Sandra Steingraber. A biologist and writer, Sandra Steingraber holds a PhD in ecology from the University of Michigan. She is the author of a trilogy of award-winning books on environmental health, Living Downstream, an ecology's personal investigation of cancer and the environment, which was adapted into a documentary film in 2010. Having Faith, an ecologist's journey to motherhood, and Raising Elijah, protecting our children in an age of environmental crisis. Throughout, she calls parents and cancer patients alike to political action. Steingraber's honors for her work as researcher and science writer include the Rachel Carson Leadership Award, the American Ethical Union's Elliott Black Award, and in 2011, the Heinz Award. By donating the Heinz Cash Prize, to the anti-fracking movement, she became, in 2012, a co-founder of New York's Against Fracking, a statewide coalition of hundreds of grassroots organizations that helped win a statewide ban on fracking in 2015. The 2018 documentary film Unfractured told the story of New York State's fracking ban, featuring Steingraber as its subject. A contributing essayist and advisor for Orion magazine, Steingraber served from 2003 to 2021 as Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Our second presenter is Dr. Laura Beane Freeman. Dr. Beane Freeman received a doctorate in epidemiology from the University of Iowa in 2003 and completed postdoctoral training in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch at the National Cancer Institute. In 2009, she was appointed to the tenure track and was awarded scientific tenure by the National Institutes of Health in 2017. She is the NCI Principal Investigator of the Agricultural Health Study, the Early Life Exposures in Agriculture Study, and the NCI Formaldehyde Industries cohort. Dr. Beane Freeman has received numerous awards recognizing her work, including 2 NCI Directors Innovation Awards and the DCEG Mentoring Award. In 2016, Dr. Beane Freeman was elected to the management group of the International Epidemiology and Occupational Health Society. She was elected Women Scientist Advisor for DCEG in 2020 and re-elected in 2022 to a 3-year term. This year, 2024, she was re-elected to a second 3-year term as Chair of Management Group of the Epidemiology in Occupational Health Conference. The focus of Dr. Beane Freeman's work includes investigating cancer risks associated with a number of occupational and environmental exposures. Specifically, she conducts research on the agricultural environment, including pesticides, industrial chemical exposures such as formaldehyde, and drinking water contaminants such as disinfection byproducts. What we'll have is Dr. Steingraber present first for around 20 minutes, followed immediately by Dr. Beane Freeman. So please hold your questions to the end of both presentations, but if you are joining us online, feel free to drop your questions in the chat or whatever medium you're using to submit questions throughout the presentations. So first, to get us started, we will welcome Dr. Steingraber. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm dedicating my remarks today to the practical farmers of Iowa and to all the organic farmers here in Iowa who are doing a lot to prevent cancer in the population here. So thank you, organic farmers. I'm going to start off on a personal note. I just turned 65, which means I now carry a Medicare card in my wallet. And it also means that this is the 45th anniversary of when I left the hospital and returned to college when I had been diagnosed with bladder cancer on my 20th birthday. My parents did not visit me in the hospital, nor did they help me with my reentry into civilian life or help me schedule the many follow-up medical appointments or navigate all the medical bills. or help me with the recurrent bladder infections I suffered and all the antibiotics I became resistant to, or the sexual trauma I experienced. And let me be really blunt for a moment. The nerves that innervate the bladder and the urethra are the same nerves that innervate a woman's clitoris. So if a young woman, undergoes cystoscopy every 3 months for 5 years, she will become sexually traumatized. So my parents were absent during my life during this time, not because they're unkind people, but because my mom was in treatment for metastatic breast cancer at the same time, and my dad had early onset Parkinson's disease. I actually felt selfish for getting cancer, like how could I do this to mom when her diagnosis was so much worse than mine, and she was already taking care of my dad. But it didn't stop there. My aunt went on to be diagnosed with the same kind of bladder cancer that I had, transitional cell carcinoma, and she died. And then, in my early 30s, I suddenly became anemic, and I had a large villus polyp removed from my rectum, which at the time of its discovery was just 1 or 2 genetic mutations away from promotion to full professor of malignancy. My gastroenterologist gave it a 50-50 chance based on what it looked like at resection of it being a colon tumor. Happily, it wasn't, and that may have been the colonoscopy that saved my life. And then my cousin, who is exactly my age, got the news that I had dreaded. She's a mom of 5 small kids, and she was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, so she was really in for it in terms of radiation and chemo. So, I'm from one of those cancer families, but here's the punchline to my own story. I'm adopted. So I'm not biologically related to any of the people I just mentioned. I share no chromosomes with my family. But we did all live in rural central Illinois, and we shared air currents, and we shared drinking water. And with every breath we take, we draw into our chests 1 pint of atmosphere, and whatever is in that air is now inside of us. We are each 65% water by weight. That water is not manufactured by our genes. It is drawn up from the aquifers under our feet. It is the sap of apples and the juice of carrots. It is raindrops and snow melt. Other than the 46 chromosomes bequeathed to us at the moment of our conceptions, our bodies are the rearranged molecules of the environments we inhabit. Whatever is in the environment is inside of us, and we rearrange those environmental molecules, and it literally becomes us. Our hair, our blood, our bones. That's from the environment. So these understandings are how I, as a young biology major who was good at animal surgery, decided for this to forsake medical school and devote my life to public health biology. So I've been speaking bluntly, and now I want to change tones here and speak in a more nuanced way about environmental human rights and the story of human cancer. Most of you in this room are committed to cancer control efforts, and out of that commitment, I ask you all to become adoptee rights advocates. U.S. adoption practices are still surrounded by antiquated secrecies and deceptions that prevent adoptees from possessing knowledge not only about their parentage, but also about our medical family history. This secrecy takes the form of sealed records and falsified birth certificates. My own legal birth certificate, for example, names my adoptive parents as having given birth to me in a city in Illinois that they've never visited or lived in. Amended birth certificates are the law of the land in all 50 states. Even though I believe that the inherited genetics is overdetermined by the medical community in assessing a patient's cancer risk, and what methods of early detection and cancer screening will be offered to that patient, and equally important, what insurance will pay for, it still matters to possess your family medical history. And too often, an adoptive person's absence of knowledge about that is treated by the medical community as no family history, and we aren't offered earlier screening. That's wrong. That colonoscopy that may have saved my life as a young woman, I had to actually invent a fictional family history in order to get it. So come on, it's 2024. The secrecies and shame of illegitimacy and infertility should not be sealing away the right to know one's own ancestry. So here in Iowa, you all sealed your adoption records in 1941, but I am happy to report that Iowa is slowly evolving. It has, as of 2022, Iowa adoptees now have restricted conditional access to their original birth certificates, and there's a mechanism to receive ongoing family medical updates. However, birth parents are allowed to opt out of that and also redact their names. So similarly in Illinois, where I was born, original birth certificates are conditional. My having access to it is conditional on my birth parents' permission. So they still have veto power over my original birth certificate as an adoptee. So I'm arguing that the right to know one's medical family history shouldn't be conditioned on other people's feelings. Inherited predispositions are part of the story of adoption, and everyone, adopted or not, has the right to know these things. So all that being said, the chances of an adoptee dying of cancer before 50 are actually more correlated with whether or not their adoptive parents met that same fate. So all the evidence, and there's not that much, but the body of evidence that looks at adoptive people finds more correlations with adoptive families than birth families, and I'm no exception to that. We know that any one tumor has multiple causes. It takes 8 to 10 mutations to put a cell on the pathway to tumor formation. In addition to that, there are all kinds of epigenetic influences. And we know that any one cancer-causing chemical is like a straw on the camel's back that can add to multiple factors, right? Binge drinking might be one, inherited predisposition might be another, but exposure to a cancer-causing chemical is another straw on the camel's back. So with that kind of perspective, I want to take a look at the Ag Health study that's done here in Iowa and also in North Carolina, which has been going on for 30 years. And you're going to be hearing more from my esteemed partner at this podium in just a minute, but I'll give you an overview. It is a prospective study of cancer and other health outcomes, including Parkinson's, for example, in a cohort of licensed pesticide applicators and their spouses. It began in 1993 in both Iowa and in North Carolina. And so there are many, many published studies that have come out of this as we have studied for 30 years, 89,000 farmers. And so what we know so far is that agricultural chemical exposures, diesel exhaust, and air pollution play a role in the story of human cancer here in Iowa. The 30 years of data show us that Iowa farmers, while they're healthier overall and have lower overall cancer rates, they have higher rates of prostate cancer, leukemia, and testicular cancers. And we know that the kind of cancers they have, we have other studies showing links to weed killers and certain kind of ag chemicals. We know in animal studies that those can cause those particular kind of cancers, and we see that the farmers, which have lower overall rates, tend to get those kind of cancers that match up with what we know from animal studies. This includes the weed killer dicamba, which is linked to liver cancer and bile duct cancer. It includes atrazine, linked to lung and prostate cancer, and so forth. There's lots more I could say on that, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. But what I want to say about this big study is that it really matters because Iowa is the #1 corn-producing state. It's the #1 user of weed killers in the nation. So that is the context in which I think you should take a look at these really disturbing cancer registry data. And so let me speak a little more specifically about that. Some of the big emerging trends. There seems to be disturbing evidence linking nitrate exposure in Iowa to cancers here. Nitrates are a kind of a shorthand for a chemical called anhydrous ammonia, which is used to fertilize corn. Corn is very kind of greedy for nitrate. So it's a synthetic fertilizer. All of anhydrous ammonia is made from natural gas. So it's a petrochemical. And it doesn't stay in the farm fields where it's applied. All of the molecules of anhydrous ammonia that are intended for corn to suck it up are not so sucked up. Instead, it runs into surface water and falls like a curtain of chemicals and enters groundwater. So we're all exposed. I was exposed in Illinois. I have nitrates in my drinking water too, involuntarily to this chemical. It enters our bodies. We pee it out. We can detect it. And in addition to these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers like anhydrous, it's also found in hog manure, which is a big thing here in Iowa. Exposure to nitrates in drinking water is linked to bladder cancer, ovarian cancer, and colon cancer. That's something to think about. That is a topic that Iowans need to be having a conversation about. Why do we grow so much corn in Iowa? Well, 40% of it is used to make ethanol, which is used to feed traffic. A lot of it going out to California to be put in internal combustion engines and cars there. So the question is, are you willing as Iowans to take the risk of bladder, colon, and ovarian cancers in your drinking water for the purpose of feeding traffic in California? Is that okay with you? And if it's not, then that has to be part of the modifiable risk factors that we talk about in the story of cancer here. A lot of the farm chemicals that are used here in Iowa, as in Illinois, were not intended to be used for the purposes to which they've been turned. Anhydrous ammonia came out of a World War I technology by the Germans when their supplies of Chilean saltpeter were cut. And they figured out how to do it, that they could make explosives and fertilizer from the same technology, hence the explosion of the Oklahoma terrorist attack in, 1995 that killed 500 people. Fertilizer was used to make a bomb, right? And that was intentional on the part of the Germans to do that. So this was a technology that was not intended to feed corn in Iowa. No one got together to say, what's the best way to grow corn in Iowa? It wasn't with anhydrous ammonia. It came out of this other wartime technology. As did a lot of your weed killers, including the phenoxy herbicides, which include 2,4-D, if that word has any meaning to you. 2,4-D and its cousin 2,4,5-T are known as Agent Orange. But before they were deployed to destroy the rainforest in Vietnam and cause cancer in our veterans who served there, they were intended to destroy the Japanese rice crop. We invented those chemicals to kill off the Japanese rice crop as a weapon of war. We dropped the atom bomb instead. So we had lots of stockpiles of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T into the war. And so they were marketed to farmers with the idea that, well, let's try to keep weeds out of the field then. So our exposure to these things isn't a result of best agricultural practice. They're historical accidents, and a lot of them started as weapons of war. And again, the question of all of us who have had cancer is, are we okay leading our lives exposed to chemicals that began as weapons of war and then for economic reasons were simply turned to these other purposes? So I want to come back now to my personal story and end here. When I bring a human rights approach to cancer, what I mean is I can look at all the cancer data as a PhD biologist and bring all the objectivity that I have when I look at that data and just let the data speak to me. I look at the confidence intervals and the sample sizes and the p-values, and I try to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But at the end of that analysis, I'm also a cancer patient. And it means that I know that behind every data point in that graph on the rising rate of ovarian cancer among adolescent girls is a human life. And that life matters. And when human lives are at stake, we act in a precautionary way to protect lives, especially when exposures happen to children, right? So here's how my own early life diagnosis kind of materially affected me as far as I can see now that I'm 65. I mean, the story of cancer survival is a kind of a binary story, right? We're either cancer survivors or we're non-survivors. We either have won and beat cancer or we lost our battle to it. But I want to bring a more nuanced view to that 45 years after my first cancer diagnosis. I don't have a retirement savings. That's because I've spent so much money paying medical bills. Bladder cancer is, of all human cancers, the one most likely to recur. It recurs in 70-some% of all patients. But it's also an organ that's accessible to the outside world through cystoscopy, unlike your brain or your liver or your pancreas. So you can live a long time if you go in every 3 months and have a cystoscope and they snip out things when they find them. Same with colonoscopies. Huge believer in colonoscopies. I've had more colonoscopies than any other person you probably met. And they keep finding little things, right, and snipping them out. So I know how to do them without anesthesia. I've done them while breastfeeding my kids. I get my colonoscopies, and I've written essays on the glories of colonoscopies. They not only detect cancer, they actually prevent cancer by snipping things out early. Same thing with cystoscopes. However, I don't have any retirement savings because I pay for all of that, right? And I lead this highly medicalized life. Thanks to cancer, I also didn't know I was gay, which is a hard thing to explain. But when young adults are diagnosed with any kind of cancer, we live this highly medicalized life at a time between 20 and 25 for me. Most people get to kind of explore their sexuality. I just didn't have that opportunity. And so I had attributed the problems I was having being a sexual person with my experience at having had cancer and the trauma that I feel to that part of my body. And that's all true. But what I didn't realize, it was sort of masking that I was looking for love in the wrong place, right? So I came out as gay in my middle age after I had my children. So I had to come out to my children first, not my parents. So that's a price I paid. A third orientation I have is this kind of human rights I bring to carcinogens, a feeling as a cancer patient who's still terrified every time I go in for a checkup 45 years later, that it's still wrong to harm and kill people, even if you can't name your victims. And that to address this, freely adding carcinogenic chemicals into our environment and being okay with that because the victims are anonymous. We don't know if it's going to be you, or you that's exposed to a weed killer and eventually, it's that straw that breaks the camel's back that eventually gives you a tumor, right? I bring systems thinking to all that, and I put agriculture on the list of things that's a modifiable risk factor, in addition to, binge drinking. We can tell people to change their drinking habits, but we can also tell our entire system of agriculture it needs to be designed in a different way. It's not okay that in Iowa you have more nitrates in your water, more weed killer use than any other state in the nation. But that's something to have a conversation about. And in this, again, as a cancer patient, as well as a biologist, I bring a precautionary approach to all this. The point is to prevent harm. We don't need absolute proof that any one of us is going to die if we don't change we don't regulate chemicals in a certain way. We just need to know it's inherently dangerous. That's the approach we take to other health problems. At one point in my life, I had to have the whole rabies series of vaccines. So did my kids when a rabid bat was in their bedroom. I was impressed that the same hospital where I got my cancer care also helped us out with this and basically said, we don't need absolute proof whether you were actually bit with the bat. When you're a 4-year-old kid, if you're sleeping in the room with a bat that's caught and found to be rabid, which is our situation, we just need to know that that's inherently dangerous, and out of an abundance of caution, we're going to give you the whole series of rabies shots, even though it costs thousands of dollars for every person who gets them. The county actually picks up those charges if you don't have health insurance, because we don't want to overlook anything, right? And that's because the rabid bats of the world haven't formed huge lobbying groups to tell our elected officials to protect rabies, right, in the way that the chemical industry controls our state governments. That's the only difference in our attitude toward rabies and our attitude toward cancer. We bring a precautionary approach to one. Rabies is a disease that's 100% fatal. Rabies vaccine, 100% effective. But we need that sort of same rabies principle brought to cancer prevention. And in this, I would say cancer patients make good agents for social change. We're brave. We know how to fight when we're scared. We know how to be transgressive and have conversations and talk about difficult things when people want us just to be happy and stop saying scary stuff. And so I think that we can be on the front lines about this. And then finally, I'll just close with words from my own adoptive mom, who didn't die of metastatic breast cancer, even though she had tumors in her liver and tumors in her bone by the time she was 46, and I was going to college. She lived until this year and died at 93. She's one of 2% of women who had metastatic breast cancer who lived for more than 30 years later. She had so much chemotherapy and so much radiation, it destroyed the great arteries of her heart, and she had all kinds of cardiac problems. She had neuropathy in her feet, so she couldn't walk, but she lived till 93. And what she told me was, don't let them bury you until you're dead, which is a great slogan for a cancer patient, and it's a great thing for an adoptive mom to tell her adoptive daughter when they're both co-cancer patients together. She and I, lived these separate lives because we were both struggling as hard as we could. My dad did die of Parkinson's disease at a fairly young age, so there was that. But later on in our lives, when we became close, that's what she left me with. And I bring that not only to my own health, right? I don't drink. I'm a CrossFitter. I run a 5K every single day. I eat all organic food. I'm doing everything I can to make the environment inside my body be healthy and safe and protective. But not burying you until you're dead means I'm willing to have that conversation about petrochemicals. I'm willing to have the conversation about the oil and gas upon which they're made, and what those industries are doing to the climate here in Iowa and affecting the way the extra flooding and extreme weather is bringing even more chemicals into the water supply. Precisely because I bring that kind of relentless, never say die determination that all cancer survivors bring to every part of their lives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sandra, for that really moving description of your experiences, and I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate being here at the Iowa Cancer Summit and having so many people here in the audience and online. The topic of this session that we came up with was agricultural exposures and cancers. What do we know? What's left to learn? And what can we do? And the perspective that I am bringing is as a cancer epidemiologist who's really devoted my research career to investigating what do we know about environmental, agricultural, and industrial exposures and how that impacts our cancer risk. As you may have caught from the introduction before, I did actually grow up in Iowa. You may not know it from our opening speaker this morning, Dr. Rathmel, the director of the NCI, and myself. There are people who work at the NCI who did not grow up in Iowa, but we just got two of us here today. So I grew up on a farm in rural Tama County. I worked on the farm, I played on the farm, I played with my siblings and my cousins, I showed 4-H calves, I did it all. So I feel like I had no idea when I was growing up that this would sort of be my life's work, but I'm really passionate about it as well. So I wanted to take a minute. I know that, we are all Iowans, and so this may not be as much news to you as it is to some other groups that I talk to, but I wanted to take a minute to think about what are we talking about when we're talking about agricultural exposures. A lot of times people just think it's pesticides. It's not just pesticides, although certainly that can be an important exposure, and we have pesticides that the farmers who are applying these chemicals experience, and also non-occupational exposure to pesticides, people who are living on farms, people who are living in rural areas. So these are really important exposures to characterize, but it also is a lot of other things. It's drinking water contaminants, it's dust, it's diesel engine exhaust, it is concentrated animal feeding operations, and nitrate. But I want to dig in a little bit more to what we mean when we talk about pesticides even. when people talk about pesticides, I say, well, you might as well be talking about chemicals because these really are a really large group of chemicals that are designed to do different things. And that really has some real implications when we think about the challenges about thinking about how we study pesticides and how we can know what we know. So I wanted to just take a minute and give you a little bit of more information about pesticides that actually includes over 800 different active ingredients that are currently registered for use in the United States. So, these are really diverse groups of chemicals. They do different things. Some of them kill weeds, some of them kill insects, some of them kill rats. But very few have actually been formally evaluated for human carcinogenicity or other chronic diseases. Obviously, they go through a registration review process that's done by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they do a number of tests on those chemicals when they come onto the market, and then they do a regular review of those chemicals. But they're not doing human studies. So when these chemicals come on the market, we actually know very little about what they do in humans, except for as we can extrapolate from rodent studies or bioassays or what we know about toxicology. But it's really hard to study pesticides in humans because people have different levels of exposure even to the same chemical. And we know that, for example, different agricultural practices influence exposure. The type of exposure application method really influences exposure levels. Whether or not you're using personal protective equipment that we know decreases your exposure if you're applying pesticides, or whether you're not wearing personal protective equipment. Some of the people in this slide may or may not be members of my family, and I won't actually tell you which ones and whether or not they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. We also know that when we're looking at pesticide exposure in a population, we know that pesticide changes over time. Pesticide use changes over time. I'm showing you a slide here of just two herbicides, allichlor and acetochlor, from 1992 to 2012, and what the pesticide use patterns were during that time period. In 1996, the US EPA registered for the first time the use of acetochlor. And when they did that, they said, well, it's the only time I've actually seen them do something like this. They said, we're going to say you can use acetochlor, but we expect you to stop using allichlor. We want you to use it less. We're not going to ban it, but we want the use of allichlor to go down. So this has impacts for how we think about what pesticides may be associated with cancer risk, because if you just look at one point in time, you may be fooled by what people's exposures are. We also know that pesticides have different mechanisms of action. And when we talk about cancer, we may think about mechanism of action for cancer, but what the regulators talk about when they talk about mechanism of action is how does this chemical kill the target pest that it is designed to kill? So for example, the organophosphate and carbamate insecticides inhibit acetylcholine esterase, and that's how they kill the insects. That probably doesn't have much to do with their cancer risk. On the other hand, the triazine herbicides inhibit photosynthesis in the chloroplasts, but they also exhibit endocrine disrupting properties, which may influence hormones in humans. So with all of these sort of complicated things that I've said, how can we actually study the effects of specific chemicals in humans? So I would argue that we need information on specific active ingredients so that we know that we can't just say pesticides because that's 800 different chemicals. We need a highly exposed population. And I say that because we are talking about probably relatively modest risks of increased cancer if we're going to find them. And so if we do a study and we don't actually have people who are exposed to the chemicals that we're interested in, but we think they are, we're going to conclude, potentially erroneously, that there's no association. So we really need to have a highly exposed population so that we can detect risks where they are. And we need accurate characterization of exposure for exposure response analyses. I think that probably most of us wouldn't have any idea what chemicals, what pesticides we're exposed to. If I asked you if you have been exposed to dicamba, I wouldn't know, if I had done that, and I would imagine that that's true of most of you. So we need ways to actually accurately assess exposure. We also need a large population with a long-term follow-up for cancer because cancer can take many years to develop. Unfortunately, we know people, and people have experiences of being diagnosed as children or as young adults, but oftentimes it does take many years for cancer to develop. And so I really appreciate Sandra kind of giving you a bit of a punchline about the ag health study, the agricultural health study. This study is really a landmark study that was started over 30 years ago, and it wouldn't have been possible without contributions from the NCI, from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. It's really kind of the preeminent cohort really in the world for cancer evaluations and studies of other non-infectious diseases. It includes 57,000 licensed pesticide applicators, primarily farmers in Iowa and North Carolina. And that was about 82% of the people who were getting pesticide licenses, and during that time period enrolled in the study, which is really important because that means they're representative of the states of the agricultural pesticide applicators in Iowa and North Carolina. They're highly exposed, and they know what they were exposed to because they were getting pesticide licenses. We also enrolled 32,000 of their spouses at the same time, and about 65% of the cohort actually was enrolled in Iowa. The schematic just sort of gives an overview of the study. Enrollment, as I said, began in the mid-1990s, where the applicators provided information on their lifetime use of 50 different active ingredients. And we've done work, including with the EPA and with NIOSH, who went out and did field studies to really make sure that the self-reported use was really sort of anchored in measurements, so they really could do that. We also have done work showing that the applicators provide reliable and valid information on their pesticide use. So that's what we're kind of hanging our hat on in the exposure assessment. We followed that up with questionnaires about every 5 years after that, and we linked to the cancer registries in Iowa and North Carolina on a regular basis, as well as state mortality registers and the National Death Index. Over the last 30 years, we've accrued about 10,000 incident cases in the applicators. So it gives us the power to really look at more rare exposures. And as has been mentioned multiple times today, all of these 10,000 cancer cases represent individuals and their own individual experiences. And we have about 5,000 cases in the spouses. So I just want to talk about cancer overall. And okay, Sandra alluded to this. This is an analysis that we did where we just took the cancer experience in the cohort and compared it to the cancer experience in the general populations of Iowa and North Carolina. And I do want to point out, as Sandra said, the cancer rates in the Ag Health study are reduced compared to the general population of Iowa and North Carolina. And that is not an uncommon thing that you see both in farming populations. We know that these populations tend to smoke less, they tend to drink less, they tend to be more physically active than the general population. But it's also just a well-known phenomenon in occupational cancer studies, because if you're healthy enough to have a job, you have a lower rate of cancer. So that is not really surprising, and it's also something that we see in studies all over the world. But we do see cancer excesses. And there are certain cancer sites, for example, prostate cancer, which is very obviously of concern in Iowa. We also see statistically significant elevations of lip cancer, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and acute myeloid or monocytic leukemia, as well as suggestive elevations in other cancer sites. We see something similar in the spouses, where they have a reduced risk of cancer overall, including reduced risk of lung and bronchus cancer. But we do see elevations, again, in certain cancer sites. And these kind of lead us to clues of like where we should really be looking for associations. So I only have 20 minutes, and I can't possibly summarize every pesticide cancer analysis that we've done over the last 30 years. But just suffice it to say that we've evaluated over 50 pesticides or pesticide classes in over 25 cancers or cancer subtypes. And today I'm going to just really kind of focus on a few results or highlights on sort of the cancers that were highlighted as most concern, driving the elevated cancer rates in Iowa: prostate, lung, melanoma, and breast. So this is a listing of all of the pesticides that we have evaluated with prostate cancer. You can see that there are a lot in the category that says no evidence of an association. And that means when I say this, I say no evidence of an association within our study. We see smaller number that has some evidence of an association. So that means maybe there's an elevation, but it's not statistically significant, or maybe it's elevated in some subpopulations and not others. And then we have 5 pesticides where we really see stronger evidence of an association. We see exposure response. We see, maybe some support from mechanistic studies, things like that. We did the same thing with lung cancer. We've actually evaluated a smaller number of pesticides, and that's because we actually have a smaller number of lung cancer cases for which we have sufficient power to actually do these analyses. Again, we have some pesticides that have shown evidence of an association, and 3 that really seem to be more strongly associated with lung cancer. Similarly with melanoma, the vast majority of the pesticides that we've evaluated don't appear to be associated with melanoma, some with some evidence of association, and a few with stronger evidence. Similar with breast cancer. Now, what I want to say is that it's really important to think about these individual pesticides, because not only, maybe some of you what you take away from this is that there's only a few pesticides that are associated with these specific cancer sites, which is a reasonable takeaway. But I also think it's really important for us to say that if we hadn't gone to all of the trouble of evaluating individual pesticides, what we would be left with is looking at pesticides overall. And many of these pesticides that show no evidence of an association actually are used quite a bit. So you would actually be underestimating potentially exposure or the link between pesticides and these cancers if you just did a more general evaluation. I want to say something a little bit about observational studies. This is an observational study, although it is a prospective cohort. We always look for supporting evidence because we know that observational studies are not clinical trials. They are not experiments. So we're always looking for support to bolster the observations that we find, either in other studies or in using other sort of lines of evidence. So we initiated a sub-study within the cohort called the Biomarkers of Exposure and Effect in Agriculture that includes 1,700 male farmers within the Ag Health Study, where we collected biological samples from these men. They were all cancer-free when they enrolled in this sub-study, so that we could really look at sort of the biological mechanisms to maybe support the observations that we saw within the larger cohort. We have a number of sort of lines of inquiry that we are conducting within this sub-study, focused on exposure assessment, looking at targeted biomarkers. We certainly know a lot about what sort of the key characteristics of carcinogens are, and we can look for evidence of that in these samples. And we can also start to use these samples for untargeted and omic approaches to look at sort of agnostic, changes in different biological samples. And I just wanted to say a little bit about pesticides and, truth about cancer. There are a number of bodies, including the National Toxicology Program at NIEHS, and certainly EPA evaluates carcinogenicity. But I just wanted to say that the International Agency for Research on Cancer has a monographs program where they evaluate agents for associations with cancer, and they take all of the data that we know from all the different lines of evidence, and they bring a big panel of experts together, and they sort of evaluate all of the evidence. And they've listed 3 as known human carcinogens. They've listed another 5 as probable human carcinogens, and they have another a number of pesticides that are sort of on the docket for the upcoming time period. And the Ag Health Study really has provided a lot of the epidemiologic data for these evaluations. I want to just say a little bit about non-occupational exposure. What I've talked about so far are really the people who are applying the pesticides themselves and probably have the highest level of exposures. But we know that non-occupational pesticide exposure or environmental exposure is also important. And we think that the spouses of the AHS applicators provide an opportunity to maybe look at this in a way where we also know what their exposures were. 60% of them said that they used a pesticide at least once at enrollment, but all of them were married to a farmer who applied pesticides. So we developed an algorithm to estimate their exposure to specific pesticides based on their proximity to the fields or agricultural drift, whether or not pesticides were being sort of tracked into the home, and also residential use of pesticides. And I don't want to get too caught up in this, in the details of this slide, but I just want to say that, we're doing a lot of work then to look at correlating the pesticide use with we collected house dust from these participants in this sub-study that I mentioned earlier. And we can see that for most of the pesticides, the more a pesticide applicator used a pesticide, the higher the dust concentrations were in their home. Now, maybe that seems sort of intuitive, but it's actually really important to demonstrate that, because that sort of indicates that people in the home maybe have higher exposures to these individual pesticides as well. I want to just say a brief little bit about other agricultural exposures. I know that there's a lot of concern about water contaminants. Sandra mentioned nitrate exposures, for example. We have geocoded address information from our Ag Health Study participants. We know what water source they used. We're using data to estimate nitrate levels at their residences. For people with private wells, for example, nitrate has been associated with colorectal cancer in other studies. That's pretty well established, that association has been observed multiple times. There are other cancer sites, such as ovarian, thyroid, kidney, that there's at least one observation of nitrate and associations with those cancers. Actually, ironically enough, those studies were actually conducted in another study in Iowa called the Iowa Women's Health Study, and it was done in a cohort of postmenopausal women that was conducted in the 1980s. So Iowa really has contributed a lot to what we know about environmental exposures. Concentrated animal feeding operations are also of big concern. We know that large-scale industrial farming is becoming increasingly common, and there are several sources of environmental emissions that may come from these operations. And there's been a lot of focus on, for example, sort of more acute or nuisance effects, but there are actually very few studies of the long-term effects of living near these concentrated animal feeding operations, including cancer. We conducted a study a few years ago, or we published a study a few years ago, looking at proximity to animal feeding operations. So I'm going to just say something about animal units, because that isn't maybe intuitive, but this is a way of standardizing, a chicken and a cow and a pig, because we know that they don't produce the same amount of waste. They don't have the same sort of, they're not the same size. So there's a calculation that you can do that can standardize a chicken and a cow. So residential proximity to animal units, and I'm just showing an example here, within 5 kilometers, and risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma within the Ag Health Study. And we see an elevation, although there isn't a strong trend, you would like to see if you're really going to try to say, well, this is an association that we believe in, that there's a strong, sort of exposure response trend. But when we looked at the type of animals, actually, you can see that the risks really seem to be driven by proximity to cattle. Now, this is very interesting, but then I think we really need to take this the next step, and we need to say, what is it about the cattle? And so we need to be looking at contaminations in the water. We need to be looking at emissions in the air, and we need to be looking at other cancer sites. And so we're working all in this area as well. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about timing of exposure and early life exposures. There's increasing evidence from lots of avenues that early life exposures may influence later cancer risk. And we know that kids work and play on the farm. On the far right is me with my calf, and in the middle is my dad and my son. My son is now 21 years old, so you can see that that's an old picture as well. But we know that kids work and play on the farm. We also have observed that people who grow up on farms in our cohort have an increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So we're really very interested in this topic. So we've designed and are launching a new study called the Early Life Exposures in Agriculture Study, and it's a cohort of the offspring of the AHS participants to evaluate their early life exposures and cancer in childhood and early adulthood. We've identified about 60,000 of their adult offspring from the AHS participants. We're really going to focus on their early life farming exposures and then look at their later risk of cancer and other outcomes. So I'm going to try to say what we know, what we've learned, and what we need to do from the perspective of an epidemiologist and a cancer researcher in that way. There's obviously a lot to be done by other groups and people with other expertise, but from my perspective, farming populations, we know that they experience a large number of exposures that are related both to their work and living in a rural environment. Although farmers have a lower risk of cancer overall, they do have some elevated risks to compare to the general population, and we really need to figure out what the drivers of that is. We do know that some pesticides seem to increase risk of specific cancers in highly exposed farmers. I just want to say as a caveat, I think it's unlikely that these exposures are unlikely to be driving the increase in Iowa's cancer rates overall. But we also know that they have other exposures to carcinogens that we haven't even talked about really, like diesel engine exhaust. We have a lot to learn, actually. So we need to really focus on the causes for the increased risks of specific cancer sites. We have a lot more pesticides to investigate. We need to understand the mechanisms, and that's important both for sort of bolstering our belief in the associations that we see, but also potentially for thinking about regulation of pesticides that may have similar mechanisms of action. We need to understand more about the exposures in the general population, pesticides, emissions from animal feeding operations, as well as drinking water contaminants. And then also we need to think about, does the timing of exposure confer different risks? So what can we do? I think as researchers, we can be asking the important questions and not just assume that we know the answer. I love this anecdote of Sir Richard Dahl, who really did the first studies, then published in 1950, like, does smoking cause lung cancer? He actually didn't think it was going to be smoking. He thought it was going to be air pollution. But he did the study anyway, and he was surprised. And we now know that air pollution also causes lung cancer, but certainly not at the risk. It certainly does not confer the risk of smoking. So it really was important for him to do the study to pinpoint that it was the smoking that was driving the elevated cancer rates. And we really need to make the data available for regulators and decision makers. We meet with the EPA on a regular basis, and they're very well aware of our studies, and we're really, trying to be very transparent with them about what our studies are showing. What can you do? You can reduce your own exposure where possible. You may think that even if you don't live on a farm, you may not have pesticide exposure, but I would argue that many of the pesticides that we have evaluated for associations are also licensed for residential use. You should be using personal protective equipment, and you should be following the labels on the products that you're using. You should get your water tested, particularly if you're on a private well. And I think I was so happy to see that they did this, but all of you should have on your tables, I think, a number of fact sheets that the Environmental Health Sciences Research Center at the University of Iowa prepared on a number of exposures. I think nitrate, radon, and arsenic. I should remember that because that's what I did my dissertation on when I was at the University of Iowa. And I really want to thank you for your attention, but I first want to say thank you to all of the collaborators. I'm up here representing 30 years of research by many, many, many people at federal agencies and universities and other partners. And I particularly want to give acknowledgement to our collaborators at the University of Iowa who've really been engaged in this project from the very beginning, many of them longer than I have. And if you want more information about our study, you can find it here. Thank you.
Wonderful. I want to first congratulate both of our presenters for staying on time and leaving room for questions, which we'll do right now. I think you all probably know the drill by now, but wait for a microphone to find you so that the online participants can hear your questions. And if there are any questions online, your questions will be read aloud. So thank you in advance for those. Looks like there's one in the back. Jason, thanks for kicking us off.
Thanks a lot. That was great. You two hit a home run to cap off the summit. So in Des Moines, there's a facility that treats nitrate in the water. It costs about $10,000 a day, give or take. And that's money that is no longer allowed to be spent on thriving other public health activities for that community. What can we do, whether it's professionals or advocates, to correct that market failure where someone else is paying an explicit cost for an upstream pollutant? Thank you.
Very easy one to start. Thanks, Jason. I'll let you guys have the microphone. Oh, yeah.
You go first.
Yeah, I actually am not sure that this is the best question for me to answer because, what I do is do the research, and I think that is the very important, very sort of first step in identifying the problem. And in some ways, it's a little frustrating and not very satisfying that, I am not an advocate. I am a researcher. I am not a civil engineer. I am not a regulator. So I think in my view, that's a community decision about how you prioritize, if you have the information available, you have a fact sheet on nitrate, and how you communicate with your legislatures or how you communicate with people who are tasked with doing something with that information. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't actually have the answer either, but I am currently inspired by another public health crisis here in Iowa, in which Iowans are really standing up and there's some traction happening, which is, and this is not a cancer-related problem, but there's a pipeline company called the Summit Pipeline, you might have heard of, that's trying to build a pipeline that will collect carbon dioxide from all the ethanol distilleries all around the Midwest and run it straight through Iowa, also the Dakotas, and it's concentrated in a supercritical form. The reason it's a public health problem is that CO2 converts to carbonic acid in the presence of water, which means if there's any moisture that gets in the pipelines, it becomes corrosive. And so these pipelines tend to breach. And when they do, breathing in supercritical CO2 will basically snuff you out. It also liquefies your own lungs and turns your lungs into carbonic acid. But before that, it can just asphyxiate you and your family. And so all these Iowa farmers are standing up saying no to eminent domain, seizing their land to build this pipeline, even though the entire state of Iowa officially has said yes to it and offered permissions and things like that. So I'm impressed with the grassroots action of farmers who are simply standing up and saying, no, you cannot seize our land to build basically a sewer system for a privately owned for-profit company. This isn't like a highway system, and using our tax dollars to do that. So that's sort of a parallel example of a community getting together and continuing to say no, even though the official answer from the state government is yes, right? And so far, it's attracted media attention in the public health community around the world, what the Iowa farmers are doing, and possibly has the ability to stop this project from moving forward. I saw something similar happen in the state where I live now in New York State. I was working as a scientist, kind of in the same capacity as Laura, in that I was researching the health impacts of fracking when New York was trying to decide whether to allow or prohibit fracking in our state. And I was giving all of my research to our state government. They were taking it all into account. And I thought that was essentially my job as a scientist in the public interest to bring this information before our decision makers. I was glad to do it, gave all kinds of testimony, wrote compendiums and so on. But what really changed the day, because we were up against the gas industry, and without some kind of social movement, the decision makers simply weren't going to look at those data. And so it took activists forming a giant anti-fracking movement to threaten the governor's political ambitions and his voting base and vote him out of office if he didn't ban fracking. And all of a sudden, I woke up one day to hear that our governor had decided to ban fracking, and I heard our state health commissioner read my own words back to me about the public health harms, including cancer, from fracking. So this is how sometimes activism actually has to open a space in the culture for science, the kind of science that Laura and I do, to speak. So it's a political issue that requires grassroots political power to bring the science forward.
Okay, I see we have a question here. We'll do one quick question. I want to double check that there aren't any online. Okay, so we'll have you wrap us up. Thank you.
Hey, thank you to both presenters. This question is for Laura. You had a picture, it was a map of North Carolina and Iowa. And Iowa had like hundreds more water sources that had extremely high nitrate levels than North Carolina. Is that because we have more private wells? Does North Carolina have regulations that Iowa doesn't have? What's going on there?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So the Iowa definitely has more private wells, and what I was showing you was the population of the Ag Health Study participants in those states. So we had more, 2/3 of the cohort is in Iowa, 1/3 is in North Carolina. So we have more, and we know that people on private wells have higher nitrate levels overall, and the population of the cohort in Iowa is more likely to use a private well than the population in North Carolina. So I think that it's difficult to sort of compare them sort of apples to apples because all of those things sort of make it, there are reasons why those levels appear higher in Iowa.
Laura, quick question. And so the premise of the study is looking at ag workers and then comparing them to the general population. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of based on the assumption that there will be a dose response. What if we've got multiple chemicals all interacting in ways we don't know, and that there's a threshold response, and that the general population, including those of us that are no longer farm boys but city slickers in the middle of Des Moines, are getting the same threshold of multiple chemicals, and that it's that threshold of multiple chemicals that's leading to cancer? Is that a hypothesis that might lead to why we don't see farm workers that are applying pesticides having a significantly higher risk of cancer? And could that perhaps explain why Iowa is number 2, or at least partially?
I think that's probably unlikely, and let me tell you why. So obviously I think that agrochemicals are important. I'm devoting my research career to them. I think it's really, so I don't want you to come away from anything I'm going to say after that to think that I don't think that this is a potentially important problem. So what I showed you was when we compared the population of the cohort to the general populations of Iowa and North Carolina, we see that they have actually a decreased risk of cancer. When I'm looking for exposure response, actually what I'm doing is comparing those, the exposure levels within the cohort. So we're looking within the cohort itself. And so we're looking for, not everybody applies dicamba, not everybody applies atrazine, these sorts of things. So we have people who are, applying just this chemical, but not that chemical. So we're looking about within our cohort of pesticide applicators, does this cancer risk, do we see an association between this pesticide and this cancer and we're looking for exposure response because this is an observational study. And the threshold effect, I don't think there's any evidence to see that that's true. And we don't really see that in other chemical carcinogenesis in most instances. And we're also not, when I say exposure response, we are not doing dosing studies. We're not measuring, going out and saying your dose of atrazine is this, your dose of atrazine is that. We are looking actually at use of pesticides. So how many days did you use pesticides? How did you apply it? What kinds of personal protective equipment did you use? And it's really kind of like a ranking more than an actual dose. So when we're talking about exposure response, I don't like to use dose response in these analyses because it's not a dose, it's an exposure response. And so I don't think it probably is that. And we haven't seen that pattern anywhere else, right? And so you grew up on a farm, I grew up on a farm. We had early life exposures. We have some exposures that we have from just living our lives, and they're probably lower now than the people who are applying the pesticides themselves. But I just don't see any evidence that it's because we're all, because there's a whole bunch of pesticides. I didn't present data on this topic here today. We're doing actually analyses of mixtures because we know that pesticides are often applied together. So we're doing a lot of work to look at the actual associations with pesticide mixtures and how that over time and also as part of a mixture. So, we can hopefully answer that question more directly, but I would say I don't see evidence in the data that we have so far to say this that there's sort of this threshold that like you just are you're exposed to a bunch of pesticides, so you don't see it in the farmers, which I think is what you were saying.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you. Okay, so I'm glad that you slipped in there with that last question because I'm always curious about the chemical soup that we're sort of living in and what that means for us. But I want to just invite us all to thank these wonderful presenters really quick before we move on. Thank you so much. It was really excellent. Thank you. I am consistently the problem moderator child of the Iowa Cancer Summit. We're running a little bit late, and that's my fault. I want to say two things really fast, though. First, Dr. Steingraber will be speaking at UNI tomorrow from 6 to 7 in the evening. This event is free and open to the public, so if you have not gotten enough of Dr. Steingraber, please join us on UNI campus tomorrow. The second thing I want to say, and Laura, Dr. Beane Freeman did a great job of pointing this out already, there are Environmental Health Science Research Center fact sheets on all of your tables: arsenic, nitrates, radon. I want to really quickly recognize Lydia Johnston for working really hard to put those together. She's right here. Tell her hi. They're going to be an excellent, excellent resource for all of us.